My guest today is Kathryn Porter. And Kathryn, what do you want to talk about today?
Oh, so I guess I want to talk about grid resilience. We've just had the initial findings from the Iberian blackout. We've got all sorts of stuff happening here in Britain, and some of that translates pretty well to what is happening around the world, particularly in developed markets. But the report says that they identified some atypical grid oscillations, and they don't go into what these oscillations were or what caused them. Then they immediately land on 3 generating units tripping off, and implying really that they were failing to meet their obligations under the Spanish grid code for fault ride through. Then they also identified that the system operator, Red Electrica, had failed to schedule enough reactive power services for the day of the 28th of April. And there's an implication that they just failed to have enough inertia on the system, although the report doesn't explicitly say that. And so then they had a situation where these 3 generators tripped off. That caused a big frequency disturbance that then obviously started to trigger the protection mechanisms on other grid equipment. The system operator then tried to instruct other reserve and reactive power services, but there was just not enough time to do that before they had a full cascading blackout. So it's kind of interesting as well that some of those protection measures, because it was a reactive power problem, some of the protection measures exaggerated the frequency disturbance and then actually also made the reactive power problem even bigger. So I think that probably accelerated the cascade in a way that a pure frequency disturbance wouldn't have done. But then clearly, the disturbance propagated into France, but France has a very high inertia grid. And so the impact on France was very localized and very limited. They were able to stop the progress through France very quickly and restore power to the affected region very quickly. And this is something the report doesn't talk about, but any sort of market observer can see that high inertia France withstood this pretty well, but low inertia Iberia suffered a full blackout. And the death toll for this has subsequently been revised up to 10 fatalities in Spain and 1 in Portugal. So this is no joke, in what I'd say were Goldilocks weather conditions, neither too hot, neither too cold. You had that many fatalities. Just imagine what that would look like, say, in Britain in the winter. I think we'd be looking at a lot more deaths.
So people are talking about inertia more lately, right? They're learning that high inertia is a good thing to keep the grid up.
Exactly. So just a little plug here. I've started recently doing a little YouTube channel to try and explain some of these grid concepts to people. It's not something I'm trying to monetize, so there's no sort of commercial angle to this. I did a video last week explaining inertia in layman's terms, because, there's a lot of interest. People are seeing this stuff now being reported in mainstream media, and they don't know what it is because it's a fairly sort of technical concept within the power market. There's a lot of industry insiders that don't understand it very well. And so, I've just tried to explain that a little bit in the way that sort of non-experts can understand. And I'm happy to go through it now if you want.
Let's go through it now. Let's do that right now. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Well, so our power grids run on alternating current. An alternating current is generated when you rotate one magnet inside the magnetic field of another magnet. This is from Faraday's law. And we put all of our magnets onto big turbines. In Europe, they rotate at 3,000 revolutions per minute. In the US and Canada, that's 3,600 revolutions per minute. And that gives you current and voltage that alternates in a sine wave pattern with a regularity of 50 cycles or 50 hertz, 50 cycles per second in Europe and 60 in the US. So literally, it's your 3,600 revolutions divided by 60 seconds in a minute. And that gives you your frequency. And so it's directly linked with the rotation of your conventional gas, nuclear, coal turbines, hydroelectric as well. Now, wind and solar, they don't produce alternating current in a conventional way. So their electricity basically comes in the form of direct current that's converted to alternating currents using electronics. And it's, broadly speaking, passive. So if they don't see the frequency and the voltage and the current on the grid doing this nice stable wave at 50 or 60 hertz, they just simply won't play. They'll either disconnect themselves or they won't inject in the first place. And there's a relationship between the grid frequency and supply and demand. So if you have more generation coming onto the system than you have people using it, that will tend to increase the frequency and try and speed up your turbines. And similarly, if you have too much demand and not enough generation, it lowers the frequency, and that tries to slow down your turbines. But conventional turbines are big, heavy lumps of metal, and it's really difficult to change the speed of motion of something that's big and heavy. So this difficulty of change is the property inertia that we talk about. It's a resistance to the change in their speed of motion, which through the conservation of energy translates directly into this frequency property. But the more that you replace your conventional generation with wind and solar, which is using electronics to convert its electricity and doesn't have this inertia property, the more unstable the grid becomes. So a small disturbance isn't dampened down the way it would be in a conventional grid, because your big heavy turbines just don't move, they don't change their operations easily. And so you make the whole grid much more fragile.
How much margin of error is there in that frequency before things go to hell?
So in Britain, our system operator has a statutory duty to keep the frequency within 1% of the 50 hertz target. Different jurisdictions set that differently, but it's essentially a 1% margin. So it doesn't mean that if you breach the 1%, you immediately get a blackout. Different types of grid equipment has sensitivity at different stages. So essentially all grid equipment has protection systems where they will set what their frequency threshold is. And normally it's two triggers. You have an outright frequency trigger, but also a rate of change trigger, where if the equipment detects the frequencies changing quickly, they'll just disconnect then because they're worried it'll go outside the parameters. And so because all the equipment has their protection measures set in different places, because that suits the type of equipment, the system, and you need a margin of comfort as well, because these things can change very quickly. The system operators tend to have to stick within a 1% margin of the 50 or 60 hertz. And outside of that, you start to get into the danger zone.
So I'm curious, in Spain, do you have a sense as to, are there bureaucrats figuring out that you can't just run the whole thing on wind and sun, and there are real world reservations or problems with this stuff?
Well, no. I was looking into their grid data yesterday. So the difficulty is that they don't publish very much data. In Britain, you can get real-time frequency data. The data aren't necessarily great. You know, there's some junk in there. They keep reporting zero values, which I keep complaining about. Clearly, it's not zero because we'd be having a blackout if it was. But they don't publish that at all in Spain. And neither does ENTSO-E, which is the European transparency platform, although I have asked them that maybe it would be good to harmonize the data that different system operators are publishing. So really, you can only go on the generation mix data. And what I've seen is that since the end of April, there's been a big increase in gas on the system, about 25% more compared with the 4 weeks before the blackouts. But offsetting that, you've got big reductions in nuclear because they've got seasonal maintenance programs underway, and a less well-explained reduction in hydro. And so actually you have a small reduction in the amount of synchronous generation, the conventional stuff on the grid. And so I think that although Red Electrica is, paying some attention to this problem by increasing the amount of gas, is maybe not doing so to the extent that is really warranted by the issue. And keeping in mind that just 2 weeks before the blackout, they boasted about running the system on 100% it was 100% renewables. And they're still in that virtue signaling mode. They did it for just a few minutes. NESO in the UK is trying to do the same. They ran at 95% renewables, although they include biomass, wood pellet biomass as being renewables, which is clearly nonsense. But they want to do 100% at some point this year. So they're pushing to reduce the minimum inertia requirements, because unless they do that, they wouldn't be able to do the 100%. But it would only be for a few minutes, because you don't have a hope of running the British power grid in the winter without gas. So to just do it in the summer for a few minutes, it doesn't mean anything. It's just virtue signaling. And the trouble is they're putting people at risk. 11 people died in this blackout in Iberia. And because essentially the system operator was playing games and virtue signaling. And it's got to stop, basically. I mean, this isn't, people died. What are you going to say to those families? Oh, yeah, but we were trying to prove the net zero concept. This is not a comfort to them.
Do you think there is awareness among voters in Spain that they realize that they can vote people out if they're virtue signaling because they really want their grid to stay up?
Well, I don't know. The press definitely is covering this. The extent to which they really understand the technicalities, I'm not sure, but I don't speak Spanish, so I'm having to translate the press articles, and then obviously something gets lost along the way. But there's been quite a backlash against the plans to close the nuclear reactors, and I think that we will probably see some reversal on that because, I mean, even in Germany, which was the most sort of gung-ho about exiting nuclear, they're now looking at maybe restarting some of their reactors. It's really difficult to see how you can get a decarbonized power grid where you don't have a contribution from nuclear unless you have huge amounts of hydro. Now, so Spain does have quite a bit of hydro, but probably not enough to really run a stable grid just with hydro and wind and solar. So I think that we'll see the sort of pressure manifest through a reversal of the nuclear closures.
So in Spain, how long did it take for the whole thing to come back up till it was 100% running? Was it days or how long?
It wasn't days. It was probably something for like 15 hours. I mean, they were 95% up by the following breakfast time. So they had gone down at lunchtime, and I think by about sort of 7 o'clock in the morning, they were about 95% recovered. So I'm not sure exactly how long it took them to get to the 100%. But yeah, they did pretty well with the black start, and not least because some of their black start units were also off on maintenance. Particularly within the hydro estate, which also wasn't really great. So, and the thing is, you really need to use alternating current generation for your to set up your waveform in the first place. So you can try and use direct current to get those generators running. And most of the black start units we have here in Britain are gas power stations with diesel generators that will start the turbines running. Because normally a power station just takes its power off the grid to get running. But if the grid's turned off because of a blackout, then you'll be a bit stuffed if you didn't have some alternative. So normally you have some units dotted around the country that are paid to have an alternative startup power source. And obviously the fuel associated, and then it costs money to test all that out and so on. And so they fire up their turbines using diesel generators, or potentially you could use interconnectors for that. And then what you want to do is you want to set up these little islands around the country of, so your first power station will start up, it will put electricity onto the grid, that will fire up the turbines at a nearby power station. But then once those turbines are running, you've got to synchronize them because you've got your current and voltage wave alternating. You need the power stations to do that, so the peaks and the troughs line up, because otherwise they'll just cancel each other out, and that will be kind of useless. So this is why we say synchronize. This is what we mean. They're not just both putting their power in the grid. They have to do it at the same, so that their peaks and troughs line up. So then you sort of have a couple of power stations synchronized to each other, and you build up these little islands, and then you try and join the islands up together. So then obviously each island has to synchronize to the next island. And that's how you restore the grid as a whole. So it's quite a technical exercise. And of course, nobody ever really tests for it because you don't turn off your grid to try it out. We have never done it in Britain. So our power grid unified in 1938, ahead of the Second World War. We'd previously run regional power grids. And so then just before year before the war, they closed the circuit breakers to join all these grids together. Nothing bad happened. And then they just left it like that. And then forever, it's been a single grid. So it's all very hypothetical. So I think the Spanish did pretty well to bring it back within like 3/4 of a day, I think it was essentially.
What odds do you think are there that Britain's going to experience something like this and have to figure out, is it going to come back up or not? Or is that likely to happen or not?
These odds are growing. We had a near miss in January, and that was actually to do with almost running out of generation. So essentially there are two ways you can have a blackout. One is you just run out of generation to meet demand. And so then really all you can do is turn off demand. You have to black some people out to stop the whole grid going down. And really that shouldn't happen. You should have good enough planning for your demand to make sure you have enough generation available. But we nearly messed that up on the 8th of January because we had quite a lot of outages on our interconnectors. We had low wind that day, and it came out lower on the day than expected because the forecasting tools aren't very good. Demand was higher than expected because the forecasting tools aren't very good. And then you had some other conventional generation off on maintenance. And so essentially what happened was, because of the poor forecasting, they miscalculated the size and timing of the evening peak. And they had to persuade one of the interconnectors that was returning from maintenance to come back early. Had that not been able to come back, or had it tripped off as it was returning, they potentially wouldn't have been able to meet demand. And so then it would have been a question of, could the engineers in the control room take the necessary actions fast enough to protect the grid before getting a cascading failure? Because they'd rather stupidly started using some of their tools in the normal running that day. So because some of the assets on the gas side were putting in high prices into the balancing market, they'd bid them off. So they'd bid off one power station. It was fully at zero just before the peak. And they'd run the hydro all through the afternoon because it was cheaper. But if you have an outage, your hydro is one of your fast response assets. So normally your batteries automatically respond to the frequency change. And then you bring up your hydro, because that can come up from 0 to full load in 16 seconds, can run for 5 hours. And you need a minimum of 25 minutes to bring a gas power station up. So they'd taken off this gas power station just before the peak. That would have needed 25 minutes to get back up. And then they had 2 running at half load that could have gone up to full load, but that would take 15 minutes. So had something big broken in those minutes between them bringing off the big gas power station and the peak actually happening, is about a 7-minute gap, they would have been completely stuffed. It would have been very difficult to identify which demand control measures they would have to take. And I suspect they would have just turned off a couple of regions of the country and hoped that was enough. But could those engineers decide to do that fast enough? Because it's been decades since anyone had to do that. So it's obviously a big deal, a big call for those people to make in the control room. So that's a pretty unusual and quite a poor way of triggering a blackout. So you just miscalculated how much generation you had. The more likely and common reason actually is because you get some disturbance on the grid that triggers all these protection measures. And that's what happened in Spain. And then everything just turns itself off because the grid is behaving in a way that the equipment thinks will damage it. And so they turn themselves off. And that is also not unlikely in Britain for similar reasons. If you run in low inertia and your forecasting is bad, and also remember, you can't really measure inertia in real time. It's an estimate. Even after the fact, it's an estimate. So it's pretty hard to control something you can't properly measure. And when your other tools, like your forecasting tools for demand and wind, are so bad, it's really easy to get into trouble with this stuff.
So in Britain, is battery backup a thing that's important either way about trying to keep the grid up, or is it not very influential?
Well, I mean, yes. And NESO, our system operators, just published its winter outlook, which is a lot shorter than normal, which is somewhat suspicious. And 2 things they want to really rely on are interconnectors and batteries. Now, interconnectors is an interesting one because at the most challenging time of the year, they do tend to start doing maintenance. And that was why we were down to 2/3 of our interconnector capacity in early January this year. The French nuclear regulator, or EDF in France, has just identified some new instances of stress corrosion in its nuclear fleet. And this is in a unit that had previously been repaired. So in 2022, all of the N4 and P4 reactors in France were taken out of service because they'd identified these cracks in the cooling systems. And as a result of that, France became an importer of electricity. Normally, it's a net exporter and tends to only import in cold weather. But all through 2022, France was consistently importing electricity. Now, if Britain thinks it's going to rely on imports to Britain to support our system in the winter and in our coldest spells, but France is sucking all the spare capacity into France because it's got nuclear outages, then obviously that starts to look like a bit of a risky strategy. We could find ourselves exporting because French prices are higher. Now, if we had system stress, then they would just simply turn off the interconnectors and stop us exporting. But nevertheless, it would mean we didn't have imports. So given that this problem has just been identified in France again, it seems somewhat optimistic to think, oh yeah, we're going to rely on interconnectors. And then batteries. So now we have a lot of batteries on the system, but these are small assets. So managing a and a state of lots of very small assets is challenging. And the tools that the system operator uses to do this are still in development. They're not going to be fully rolled out until next year. So again, it's an estimate. They're guessing how much they have. They're guessing how they're going to behave. What we found on the 8th of January was that quite a lot of the batteries were charging during the evening peak, not discharging. So then, obviously, they can change quite quickly from charging to discharging, but they'll run out quicker because obviously they weren't fully charged. So the amount of charge they have available to deploy is by definition limited if they were charging immediately before you did that. So I do think that reliance on these things, particularly when you don't have good visibility, is quite a bit of a risk.
What do you think of this whole idea of we all have Teslas, and then when the grid needs extra juice, it takes juice out of our Tesla batteries in our garage? I mean, you hear stuff
I think
like
this is a fantasy, right? So our power grid should be a service that serves our needs as consumers, not that we prop up the grid by allowing them to discharge our car batteries at their own discretion when it suits them, right? And also, all these things are expensive. So it's only a minority of people that can afford them. Most people in Britain don't own an electric car. We've actually seen sales of electric cars falling. Insurance is going through the roof, so that impacts affordability even more. There are certain safety concerns when using them. So when you break down, they don't necessarily roll. We've invented these things in Britain called smart motorways, where there's no hard shoulder. So if you break down, you're supposed to try and get to a refuge that's a little sort of lay-by at the side. That's difficult in a conventional car that you can roll. But in an electric car that might not roll if it breaks down, then you are just a sitting duck. So I definitely wouldn't buy one. I mean, I try and avoid these smart motorway things in the first place. Even in my conventional car, I don't think they're a good idea. People keep dying because, the idea is that they're monitored, and if someone breaks down in a live lane, some control room will activate a gantry sign that tells people not to use that lane. But they don't notice that often. So they fail to notice the broken down car until other cars have crashed into it. And, people have lost their lives as a result. So there's a lot of issues with these electric cars that I don't believe the narrative of demand side flexibility. And it's interesting here in Britain that we used to have this scheme called triads. And effectively, our transmission network charging was based on the demand that you had on the grid during the 3 highest half hours of demand in general between November and February, and separated by 10 business days or some other rules. But these 3 highest settlement periods were called triads, and they determined your share of transmission charges. So for big industrial users, that could be very significant. So a whole industry evolved around what we called triad avoidance, making sure you weren't consuming too much in those peak periods. That used to deliver 2 gigawatts of demand response from industrial and commercial consumers to the grid. Now, Ofgem, our regulator, decided that actually this was a bit unfair because domestic consumers couldn't really participate in this triad avoidance. And it wasn't really reducing the cost of running the grid. It was just moving around who paid for it. It was essentially a zero-sum game. So they abolished it, and now they've come up with a different way of allocating transmission costs. At the same time, they created this thing called a demand flexibility service, where everybody, including domestic providers, can sign up using their smart meters to reduce demand when asked by the system operator, and you get paid something for it. The amount of demand reduction that's delivering is 200 megawatts. So a 10 times reduction on the amount they were getting under triad avoidance. So this whole demand flexibility, you're going to have to pay a lot more for it than you did before to get it. And people, that then will feed back into your bills. So people are just not going to want to pay for it. It's not going to be efficient.
So related to this smart roadways thing, wasn't there another deal where they were going to reduce lighting on the highways somehow? A virtual...
No, they're still talking about that.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing is they want to do it on the motorways. So I live in a very rural area here, and we have no street lighting at all. And I love driving on unlit roads. In a rural area, driving on unlit roads in the dark is actually kind of fun. And it's pretty good because you see if the stuff coming because of the headlights, you get good notice. So that's great. On motorways, though, the motorways tend to be a bit too busy for you to use your main beam, but not quite busy enough that the headlights are providing good illumination. So then that becomes, there are some unlit motorways in Britain, and I don't really enjoy driving on them for that reason. There's never a sweet spot where you can just put your main beams on and see everything you need to see the way there is on rural roads. So I do think they should do it in towns, though. I think in urban areas, it would make a lot of sense. You could turn off your streetlights at, say, between 1 and 5 in the morning, something like that. And you save quite a lot. Now, you might have to, upgrade your pavement surfaces. So unlike in the US, we walk a lot in Britain. So we have sidewalks, not just in cities, but sort of outside cities, in suburbs and even in villages and things. And they're not always in great condition. So if you're walking along them and it's dark, it's easy to fall over and then people could be injured and then they'll sue the council and, the savings from the lights will soon get taken away in compensation. So there are some things like that to think about. But generally speaking, we use a lot more lighting in our urban areas than we really need. And so there is scope to reduce it, but I'd say leave the motorways alone.
Okay, switching gears a little bit. Do you have an opinion on exactly what happened in Texas for their blackout in 21, I think it was? What do you think happened there?
Yeah, so that was quite a different situation because ERCOT, unlike a lot of the other operators around the US, didn't have any rules in place around weatherproofing infrastructure. And so then when they had the very cold weather from Storm Uri, a lot of assets froze up. You had a lot of frozen pipelines, a lot of frozen wind turbines, and you couldn't then deliver the energy that you needed because of frozen infrastructure. And now I think they've actually changed the rules now. I'm not an expert in Texas energy regulation, but I think I did read that they'd changed the rules to try and avoid that happening again, because this wasn't so much, it was a regulatory failure rather than a market failure, shall we say. I don't think they just anticipated that the whole grid could freeze to the extent that it did and that you couldn't move gas to your power stations and to people's homes. And that obviously had a very significant impact. And then because of the way the pricing works, a lot of people lost a lot of money as a result. So I think that those reforms should prevent that from happening again.
Okay. Just before we hit record, you were talking about the long lead times for some equipment for the power grid. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So this, across all of the developed world, we started developing our power grids back in the early 20th century. And in fact, next year is the 100-year anniversary of the Electricity Act 1926, which was a pivotal moment in the British energy market. The Conservative government of the day, and this is unusual because it's not the usual MO of Conservatives, was to nationalise the entire electricity infrastructure. And the reason for this was that in the early years of the industry, everyone just basically did what they wanted. So you had different providers of electricity selling electricity at different voltages, at different frequencies. And then if you moved house, you couldn't take your stuff with you because it just wouldn't work. You had lights that worked on one voltage, they didn't necessarily work at another voltage. And it was all kind of chaos. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of these providers, even just in London, all doing different stuff. And the government was like, this is like chaos. Now everyone's wanting electricity, but, we've got to have some sort of uniformity. So they said the best way to do this is we just nationalize everything and we will start to build a high voltage transmission system so that we can move electricity around the country. And eventually, everyone should have access to this electricity. So that was really the beginning of our power infrastructure. I think in the US, it sort of started a bit earlier with the Chicago Fair in the 1880s when Tesla won the Battle of the Currents over Edison. And so all of these countries started at broadly the same time to build out their electricity infrastructure. And obviously they added to it. We're not typically relying on 1920s equipment now. We had a huge spike of investment here in Britain in the 1970s. But that means that a third of our transformers date to the 1970s. A third of our switchgear was built in the 1970s. And half of our power lines were built in the 1970s. And this is not uncommon. If you look at the typical age of conventional grid equipment across the developed world. It's all sort of, decades old. And in some cases, nearing end of life. Your transformers shouldn't really be lasting more than 60 years. They're not really rated to go longer than that. So it's we've spent all our money recently connecting renewables and really neglected conventional equipment. And then obviously with COVID and the Ukraine war, that created an affordability crisis. And so this trade-off was really made to focus on renewables. And that means that a lot of our legacy equipment is not only old, but also running at rates higher than its rated capacity. The transformer that blew up taking out Heathrow Airport a couple of months ago, that was installed in the 1960s and was running at 106% of its capacity and had been for several years. It was an identified problem that people have been talking about, that in a very congested part of the London grid, these very old transformers were running at above their capacity. So this is a challenging situation. You now have 4-year lead times for new transformers. So you can't quickly fix this either. And then the other problem we have here in Britain is a lot of our gas infrastructure is very old. Now, our government wants to have what they call Clean Power 2030, which means that in 2030, we'll only use unabated gas to meet 5% of average annual demand. But the system operator has identified that we will require the full 35 gigawatts gas fleet that we have today to remain available for that 5% of the time, because on those days when you have high demand and low wind, you won't be able to keep the system running without gas. Now, that's all very well, except that 10.5 gigawatts of our gas fleet was built in the 1990s. And although they did, most of them go through some significant upgrades in the early 2000s, you typically don't see GTs running much more than 30 years. So they're pretty much at their 30 years now. And so by 2030, you have this huge retirement risk of a third of our gas fleet. And then almost a third were built in the 2000s. So, their days are numbered as well. And they haven't necessarily had the upgrades that would take them to a 30-year life. So we have this big retirement risk around our gas plants. We're not seeming to do anything about it. It's now an 8-year lead time to get a new gas turbine. So that takes you well beyond the expected lives of some of these units. And even for a major refurbishment, I'm hearing that it's like 18 months to get the parts. So again, these are things that we need to see coming and start planning for. And there's just no evidence that planning is happening. And so I really worry that our system operator, particularly here in Britain, but I think this is true elsewhere as well, taking that eye off the ball when it comes to the state and condition of our legacy assets. And if they don't start looking forwards, and also we have a huge challenge with our software. The software we use to balance the grid dates back. It's literally a relic of the privatization era. It was built in the 1980s. It hasn't materially changed since 2001, which is when our market setup that we have today was created. But the software itself was written in the 1980s. There was a scheme launched in 2008 to replace it that was cancelled last year and replaced with another scheme that's being sort of implemented in phases. But nevertheless, today, we're still using 1980 software to balance the grid.
No,
and it keeps breaking.
Do you think it's inevitable then that these old transformers are going to just blow one at a time and cause a lot of power outages in the next 10 years?
Yeah, so the transformers will create localized outages. The one in West London that took out Heathrow took out about 66,000 homes and businesses. So it didn't affect a particularly wide area. And if it hadn't been for the fact that it had affected Heathrow, probably it wouldn't have had the attention it did. And, to be perfectly honest, I'd say Heathrow itself bears most of the responsibility for that because they failed to learn the lessons of Atlanta 2017. There was a very similar transformer fire that took out Atlanta Airport for a day back in 2017, and all the US airports learned that lesson. They put in place auto switching between grid supply points or on-site generation. So JFK, for example, has 110 gigawatt gas CHP on site that provides its energy needs. Heathrow should really do the same, and not faff about with its 10 megawatt biomass, which is a pretty stupid thing to have in West London anyway. But, this is the idiocy of some of our net zero planning. But yeah, so transformer outages, I think, will take out local infrastructure the way we saw there. But if you had an outage on your balancing software for the grid on a day like, say, the 29th of May, I think it was, when we had very high wind, but it was lower than it was expected to be, and the control room did almost 25,000 balancing instructions, there's no way that you can do that if your software fails. If you have to go back to manual instruction, and when that software fails and it has regular outages, they have to instruct power stations by phone. So you can't do that 25,000. That turns out to be 17 a minute. You can't make 17 phone calls in a minute. It doesn't, and they don't have enough staff to be able to do that, and certainly not on a regular shift. So, so these are all these risks that we're running sort of behind the scenes. Our forecasting tools are terrible. We're trying to use ancient tools for balancing the grid. Our physical infrastructure is old and vulnerable, and then we're taking liberties with experimental low inertia running. These things are recipes for disaster.
How about this other threat you hear about some big solar flare or some electromagnetic pulse that kind of fries everything? How much do you worry about that one?
I suppose I don't really worry about it so much because I'm not sure that there's a huge amount you can do about it. Yeah. I mean, solar flares will happen, and I mean, it's in the same way. Do we really sit around worrying about a meteor strike? Yes, we could get hit by a meteor and it might wipe out 90% of life on Earth, but there's not a huge amount we can do about it. So I know that people do try and look at whether they can harden the grid against things like solar flares, but I think there's a lot more mundane risks that we're ignoring.
Yeah, somebody else was talking about the Carrington event where people, they shut off their, the telegraph lines and they still worked because do you think if we had some event like that, how big of a deal would that be? Is it hard to say with our model? Well, how much effect would that have? Yeah,
it is hard to say, and I don't know that there are models for it.
Yeah,
we're so integrated now with digital infrastructure that the impacts would be bigger. Yeah. But I would say the first thing that we'd see impacted would be whatever we have up in orbit. So we're going to notice quite a big impact on telecoms and things like GPS and so on. Before we'd see it on the ground level. So yes, I mean, there's huge amounts of chaos that can be created from that even aren't related to the power grid that, it's really difficult to mitigate against.
So what do you see in the next 10 or 15 years in terms of load on the grid from either AI or if we actually do transfer into lots of electric cars?
Well, so I think electrification is actually going to be a much slower burn than people are saying. We're seeing a decline in uptake of electric cars. We're not seeing any particularly great interest in heat pumps. I think early adopters have adopted already, and the rest are just not so keen. So you can't really take that initial trajectory and extrapolate it. I think the AI data centers really are the game changer, though. You look at Ireland, for example, and they have now run out of capacity for more data centers. Data centers have been and this is not even AI data centers, just regular data centers, been a huge driver of economic growth in Ireland, but they've used up all of the available electricity capacity. So you just can't put any more in. And now the whole question is, if you want to get planning for a new data center, you've got to figure out where the electricity to power it's coming from. We're going to have problems here in Britain. And again, I don't think anybody's really on top of this, but there are data centers sniffing around middle-aged gas assets here. And the problem is that if they do that, they will take them onto a private wire. So you'll lose that off the grid. You've seen, I suppose, a virtual version of that in the US, where tech companies have been trying to sign PPAs with existing nuclear reactors. And, local authorities have objected because that takes that capacity away from regular consumers. And obviously, although they're all interested in building SMRs, that's not something that you can deliver quickly. GE Hitachi have just started digging in Canada, and that's going to be the first small modular reactor program anywhere in the West. I think really the answer is going to be with gigawatt scale reactors. And if we all had any sense, we'd be beating paths to KEPCO's door to get them to build their APR 1400s for us, because they're really where the game's at the moment. And I don't know, weirdly, that's not on the radar in the US. I was at PowerGen back in February and listening to presentations where they were extolling the virtues of the AP1000 and talking about as if it was the only game in town. But the APR 1400 is certified in the US, and they've got 8 of those running, 4 in UAE and 4 in South Korea. They've just started construction of another unit in South Korea. They were built at an average cost of between $5 and $6 billion in 8.5 years. So way better than Westinghouse achieved at Vogel, way better than EDF's achieved either in Finland, the UK or France with its EPR. And so, yeah, for some reason that's sort of sliding under the radar a bit. But nuclear is really the only way to meet that new demand. And I know actually in Texas, they're trying to use some of the surplus wind in the west of the state, but they're supplementing that with gas because there's no way you can get the required reliability from wind. But what you can do in West Texas with gas, you can't do in other places.
So I had Cal Abel talking on here a while back about natrium. Is that something that you're either a fan of or
not something I really know a great deal about?
Okay. But you do see nuclear is the answer from your perspective for the next 20 years?
It is.
Yeah.
So the people are talking a lot about novel nuclear technologies, but I think the speed with which we need to deploy new nuclear doesn't lend itself to novel technologies, which is why I talk so much about the KEPCO design. You want to do what works when you need it quickly. Do stuff that you already know how to do, where you have established supply chains and you have some workforce that knows how to do it. And, KEPCO is the clear leader in that regard. When it comes to novel technologies, yes, there's a place for it. And I do think we should be restarting our fast breeder reactor programs. I think we should be looking at more at thorium. And I definitely think that small reactors are interesting, although I don't think people have really thought through the safety case. I was talking recently to a former energy minister here in Britain, and he was, waxing lyrical about small reactors. And I said, yeah, okay, but here in Britain, so we don't have armed police in Britain routinely. But in our high security prisons, we have armed police. We have armed police protecting the royal family and things like that, or the military. And then our nuclear constabulary is armed. And we have a handful of nuclear sites around the country with a very secure perimeter and armed guards. And this has a cost to it. Now, if you're doing it with a 2 gigawatts nuclear site, that's one thing. But if you're trying to do it with a 200 megawatt nuclear site, well, that's a whole other story. And if your 200 megawatt nuclear site happens to be co-located with a refinery or something that's full of all kinds of other dangerous stuff that makes it some sort of an appealing target to bad actors, then you're going to have to find some way of scaling your security and making that work. And that is something. And so this former minister I was speaking to sort of went quite pale when I mentioned this. And he's like, nobody ever mentioned anything like that to me before. Not when he was in office trying to, approve these things and not subsequently. So I'm like, well, that's because they're still a bit too far away. But once they start to become, more imminent, then you're going to have to deal with these questions. And that security cost is not going to be insignificant. Now maybe in America where, the armed thing is much more common, the cost implication won't be as high. But certainly here in Britain, our police are not routinely armed. In fact, because of recent scandals, we've had a lot of our armed officers turning in their firearms licenses because they're worried about prosecution. And so, yeah, it's going in the wrong direction.
Who else's work do you like in this whole space about keeping the grids up, et cetera? Anybody else you can recommend?
Yes, so David Turver, he writes the Eigenvalues Substack. So he's very good. He does a lot of detailed analysis. Andrew Momford at Net Zero Watch, he also does quite a lot of detailed work. He's looking particularly around the costs of wind farms and really demonstrating that the capital and operating costs haven't been falling. He works a lot with Gordon Hughes at University of Edinburgh, who's done quite a bit of research into this as well. One of the benefits we have in Britain is that as soon as you incorporate a business, you have to file your accounts and they're publicly available. And a lot of these wind farms are incorporated as special purpose vehicles specifically for the wind farm itself. So they don't really have any staff. It's just the wind farm. And so when you look at the accounts, there's a pretty clean view actually of what the thing costs, both the capital and operating costs. There's little in there by way of corporate overhead. And so you can then actually uncover what are the cost trends around the industry. And so what we're finding is that, you had expensive wind farms and then in the 2010s, the costs were coming down. But then from the sort of late 2010s onwards, the costs started going back up again. And now we're seeing costs going up quite a lot. Even the auction rounds for the subsidies have reflected that, which previously they didn't, partly because of gaming and partly because of assumptions people were making about end of life value. So that work is quite worth looking at because it uncovers some of the myths around what people think about the cost of renewables. So yeah, I mean, I think that off the top of my head, those are the people that I think are interesting. And then over in the US, Meredith Angwin, she wrote Shorting the Grid, and I'm sure you're aware. And her work's also worth a follow. She has a Substack called The Electric Grandma.
Yeah, she's been on here a couple of times. David Turver's been on here, Andrew Montford. So
Yeah.
a lot of interesting folks. There's a lot of demand for you lately people want to hear what you have to say about this stuff lately in particular. Is that true?
Yeah, it is. So a couple of years ago, people were quite interested in me because I'd sort of anticipated Norway starting to get very sort of hawkish on interconnectors. And just before they announced the First Amendment to their Energy Act, where they started giving themselves power to curtail electricity exports, I'd written about that. And so the fact that I sort of saw that coming when nobody else in GB had been talking about it sort of put me on the map a little bit. And then more recently, the 8th of January blackout, the analysis I did on that sort of went viral. I mean, my tweet, last time I looked, it had been viewed 450,000 times, which given I only had like 1,500 followers at that point, was quite something. So yeah, so I'm doing a lot of podcasts at the moment. I've started, as I said, my YouTube channel, and I've been doing a lot more engagement with the general public. So I've the last few years I've done a fair amount of TV, radio interviews, and mostly around the price cap, but then also around sort of other developments. But then I was invited to go and address a public meeting a couple of months ago just to talk about energy. And there was literally like 60, 70 people, just regular members of the public turned up to listen to me talk about energy. And I told them right at the outset I was going to give them a physics lesson, expecting to see, like the shutters closing in. And they were all really engaged and really interested, which I was quite encouraged by. I think we probably talk down to people a little bit too much about the sector. And so, yeah, that's one of the things I'm trying to do is just sort of widen understanding of what's going on in the hope that it gets addressed before it breaks. And so I'm very pleased that actually I'm engaging with not the government, because they don't talk to anybody really, unless they're sort of on the same sort of net zero zealotry. But I do talk a lot with the opposition politicians and with the regulator about these issues. And I think that's, I'm really pleased with that, because that's where it can have an impact.
So where are the best places that people can look to find your work, read more about it?
So for the technical stuff, I have a blog, what-logic, what as in WATT. So that's what-logic.com is my blog. And I typically repost my blogs onto Twitter and LinkedIn. LinkedIn, again, is more for technical discussion. Twitter is a bit more sort of to the point, sort of more for public consumption. And then if you want to start looking at some of my videos about how the electricity market works, then I've got my YouTube channel as well. I've only got 4 videos up on there at the moment because it's quite time consuming and I'm a sole trader. So it's like I have to do everything by myself. I'm the tea lady as well as the CEO.
Very nice. All right. Any other points you want to make before we finish up this one here?
No, not really. I mean, I think the main point, and we didn't really talk about it, but there's so much misinformation about the energy transition. And a lot of it is just not true. Renewables, certainly in the UK, renewables are not cheaper than gas-based generation. Now, this is a demonstrable fact, and yet our policymakers still insist that renewables are like 9 times cheaper than gas. It is just not true. We had a year and a half, 2 years where gas was expensive. We had 25 years before that where gas was not just really cheap, but had low volatility. And that's just been really quickly forgotten because nobody talked about it. And yet, despite that really long-term low pricing, from 2006 onwards, we saw our bills starting to increase dramatically while wholesale prices remained really low. And this was the impact of net zero policies, effectively, because in Britain, all of that cost is pretty much recovered through bills. We don't really take very much out through taxation. And so I calculated that since 2006, in today's money, we've spent £220 billion on the energy transition. And that's even including even including the cost of gas during the Ukraine crisis, we were £220 billion worse off than had we not done the energy transition. So, yeah, I published a report into this in about a month ago now. That's available on my blog. And I look into, and it's obviously from a GB context, but I look into all of the elements of cost associated with renewables. So not just the initial subsidy to get the stuff built, but the cost of backup, the cost of connecting it. Because our grid infrastructure is not very good, we end up curtailing it quite a lot. So that we're spending a couple of £1 billion a year just on that. And then managing real-time intermittency is costing us a few billion extra a year as well. So all of these things add up to quite big numbers at the end of the day, and they're leading to deindustrialization. Our manufacturing is shutting up shop and moving to China, and it's putting more households into fuel poverty.
So not a lot of positives there. All right.
Sadly not.
All right. So I'll let you go. Thank you very much for what you're doing. You're a very interesting person, and I love the fact that you're digging into this stuff so deeply. I love it.
Great. Thank you.
Talk to you later. Bye.
All right. Bye.